This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper discusses his book, A Sacred Oath. He speaks about his time serving in the Trump administration.
I'm probably not the first defense secretary or cabinet member to face this, where people propose ideas that you just think are wrong or inappropriate. And my job is always to push back, right? And if it's the president, to offer up better ideas, better solutions, try and meet his intent and get to a better, more enduring place that's best for the country, consistent with what the president is trying to do.
He's interviewed by National Defense Industrial Association Chairman Arnold Punaro.
Well, I'm honored and privileged to be here this morning with former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. I might also say former Secretary of the Army Mark Esper, Colonel, retired United States Army Mark Esper, served in uniform on active duty, served in the Army National Guard, served in the Army Reserve, one of the few people I know that served in all three components of the United States Army for a distinguished 21-year career. Dr. Esper, Ph.D., Vice President Esper of one of the largest defense and aerospace companies that we have in our defense industrial base, professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, head of policy on the House Armed Services Committee, National Security Advisor to one of the most distinguished senators, Fred Thompson. A very varied career, and you brought extensive background to your role as Secretary of Defense. And we're here today to discuss your book, which is entitled A Sacred Oath, Memoirs of a Secretary of Defense Through an Extraordinary Time. And I'd like to start by saying that I believe, if I'm correct, that when you graduated as a second lieutenant from West Point, you raised your right hand and you said, I, Mark Esper, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties on the office on which I'm about to enter, so help me God. I take an oath. You took an oath to the Constitution. Is this what you're referring to, Secretary Esper, when you talk about the title of the book, The Sacred Oath?
Well, first of all, General Punaro, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and litany of my resume. But yeah, look, it's the Sacred Oath. And actually, that was the second time I took the oath. The first time as an 18-year-old with freshly cut hair and a new uniform as a West Point cadet in 1982. And I took that oath another dozen times or so after that. And to me, that's what it came down to, is my sacred oath as I navigated my way throughout a career, but really in the 18 months or so that I served as Secretary of Defense, I often had to go back to what is my oath and what guided me. You know, the principles of West Point's motto of duty, honor, country is what I often had to go back to and ask myself, what is the right thing to do in this situation?
So give me a little bit better explanation. That was a great explanation, but a little bit more insight. You approached something that in the book you call values-based decision-making. You were looking at values. Was the values tied back to the oath? It was tied to duty, honor, country. Your West Point class had its own motto that you used. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think, for any cabinet secretary, you have a lot of authority and responsibility, particularly with the Department of Defense. 2.8 million people in terms of service members and civilians. Responsible for operations around the globe. It's a hefty job. And so you have to have certain things to guide you. It begins with the national security strategy, what the president wants to accomplish, your national defense strategy. But at the end of the day, it comes back to your moral compass and those principles that guide you. And for me, in many of those situations where I didn't have sufficient guidance or had to sort through the situation myself, I went back to those core values of what's important for our national security or what's important for the institution of the Defense Department or even more so, what's important to the institution that we call the profession of arms. And those things are very, very important to me, particularly when you consider the unique relationship that the United States military has with the American people and how special it is that in our country, as compared to many, many others, we understand the role of the military in society and that the military takes its guidance from civilian leadership.
But there were a number of times when there were decisions that you didn't agree with, and you were talking sometimes to the president, sometimes to some of his senior people in the White House, where you actually said, as you said in the book, my oath is to the Constitution, not to the individual.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, look, there are any number of occasions, and I'm probably not the first defense secretary or cabinet member to face this, where people propose ideas that you just think are wrong or inappropriate. And my job is always to push back, right? And if it's the president, to offer up better ideas, better solutions, try and meet his intent and get to a better, more enduring place that's best for the country, consistent with what the president is trying to do. So that becomes your role. And as I think about it, I always got to go back to what is my oath? And my oath is to the Constitution. It's not for any of us, it's not to a president, it's not to a party, it's not to a philosophy, right? It is to the Constitution. And I think the reason why we have a Senate confirmation process is that Congress, the people's representatives, want to know that that's what's guiding you and that's what you intend to adhere to. And that's what I promised when I was confirmed 90-8 in July of 2019.
One of our colleagues, Dr. Charlie Stevenson, a former professor at the National Defense University, has wrote a book titled The Nearly Impossible Job of Secretary of Defense. Secretary Austin now is the 28th Secretary of Defense. You were the 27th. Charlie's book was written before your tenure, so he covers a number of your predecessors. But he talked about the job of running the largest, most complex organization in our own federal government, I would argue in the world. You're talking about 1.3 million active duty, 880,000 drilling reservists, 750,000 civil service employees, 750,000 contractors, 5,000 locations worldwide. And he said that it's really nearly impossible. And then you talk about how you had some extraordinary circumstances that you were dealing with beyond those that your predecessors had to deal with. You had a global pandemic, the likes of which we hadn't seen in over 100 years, and you had to put in place Operation Warp Speed. I'd like to get to that. You were still dealing with wars on the ground where our troops were in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan and other areas. And you had some of these other concerns about, withdrawing troops from Europe or bringing troops back from Syria. Talk a little bit about, you titled it Extraordinary Times, but frankly, I think the title Nearly Impossible Times probably would apply to your tenure when you think about all the things that you had to deal with and some of the challenges, because you talked about the commander-in-chief. In the book, you said he was idiosyncratic, unpredictable, and unprincipled, and yet you were having to make decisions to deal with all those issues with that person was your boss, no question about it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, it is a great job. It's a very demanding job, and you have to rely on the people below you to really deliver. And I had a great crew of both civilian and military leaders to do it. But when you think about the scope of it, on one hand, you have to be a diplomat and a statesman and engage in foreign policy. Next, you have to run the department. You're responsible for the combatant commanders and giving them direction on how to function around the globe in terms of military forces. You have to give guidance to the service secretaries and service chiefs about how to prepare for the future, how to organize their forces, equipment to buy. And then, of course, you're responsible for schools and hospitals and child development centers and, the health and welfare of not just service members and civilians, but I think there's up to 10 million other dependents who rely on military health care. So you have all that, right? And then on top of that, at least during my tenure, and look, it's a demanding job regardless, but we do face this first global pandemic in 100 years. We got the war in Afghanistan. We have conflict in Syria. We have the aftermath of the exchanges, the conflict with Iran. And then you put on top of that, civil unrest. You put on top of that all the other things we face. And it was a really demanding time. And I'm, quite frankly, very proud of what my folks were able to do during these very challenging times of 2020 and how we navigated all this to both defend America abroad, but support America at home, either, like you said, with COVID, Warp Speed. But recall, we had 20, 30, 40,000 people, Army doctors, nurses, and others deployed in cities across the United States, setting up field hospitals and reorganizing the Javits Center into the largest hospital in the United States to deal with COVID. And many of these service members, God bless them, particularly the National Guard, left home and risked their own lives, their own welfare, to treat their fellow Americans. It was a monumental time for the U.S. military.
Well, when governments are incapacitated, large geographical areas, was the case with COVID. There's only one outfit in our country that can do that, and that's the Department of Defense. We do it for hurricanes. We do it for fires. Right. We did it for the civil unrest. We did it for COVID. Because you were Secretary of the Army, you knew the head of the Army Materiel Command, General Gus Perna. And when it came time to put Operation Warp Speed into effect, and let's face it, you had some very talented scientific medical experts, but my understanding, and I had the opportunity to work with him a little bit, particularly to help him get ready for his confirmation, but also for his testimonies before the Hill. It was pretty much a DOD operation. And my understanding is it really did go at warp speed, because people predicted that we'd never see a usable vaccine for years and years and years. Talk a little bit about that and what was accomplished by Operation Warp Speed and the personnel from the Department of Defense that were integral to that success.
Well, look, you're so right about Gus Perna, but first of all, let's talk about outcomes. It was probably the greatest public-private partnership in U.S. history, and probably, in some ways on parallel with the Apollo program. And I will tell you, there were a lot of skeptics that said you'll never get a vaccine with sufficient efficacy out in time. It'll take 5 to 10 years. And yet, this combination of DOD and HHS, right? I was able to co-lead it with Alex Azar. We delivered in less than 12 months, less than 8 months, 2 vaccines with 90% plus efficacy. And you and I wouldn't be sitting here together without face masks if it weren't for those vaccines. But go back to where it began. Yes, I got to know Gus Perna, General Perna. He was the head of Army Material Command. At a time when we were making sweeping changes in the Army, I stood up Army Futures Command, a way to kind of break the acquisition gridlock and so that we could modernize the Army from the Reagan era. And Gus Perna, I quickly learned, was a selfless team player who put his duty first and was willing to give up parts of his organization for the better good of establishing AFC. And that told me a lot about him. So when it came time in the spring of 2020 to set up Warp Speed, and DOD's specific responsibilities were logistics, but really distribution, manufacturing, pulling that piece of it all together, it was very apparent to me and General Mark Milley that Gus Perna was the right guy. And look, he was about ready to retire, and yet he came back, he extended his active duty time, and worked 24/7 and delivered for the American people. Look, we had our share of hiccups, but by the time I think President Biden was inaugurated in January, we were delivering over 1 million doses a day to the American people. Just a tremendous effort, and he and our counterparts at HHS deserve a lot of credit.
Amen. And I enjoyed talking to him because he came from Italian background like I did. So we talked about our grandparents that had come from Italy and, of course, the kind of foods that we like to eat, spaghetti and meatballs, and a little glass of wine here and there. So he was just a great leader and great accomplishment. Let's talk a little bit about, because I want to get into a series of questions of the role of the Secretary of Defense. The statute that governs the Department of Defense is primarily found in Title 10 of U.S. Code, and that was updated in 1986. I was privileged to be the staff director of the Armed Services Committee when we passed what is now known as the Goldwater-Nichols Act. And to make sure we had total civilian control of our military, we put in Title 10 that everything in the Department of Defense is subject to the authority, direction, and control of the Secretary of Defense. And that was your understanding of your statutory authorities, correct?
Right. Well, look, I learned Goldwater-Nichols all the way through my career in the Army. And, of course, it was passed the year I graduated from West Point. And absolutely, look, the Secretary of Defense has all the authority. There are only 2 people, in fact, in the entire United States that can deploy U.S. troops abroad. It's the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. So every couple of weeks, I would sign deployment orders. And the chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. We have a series of both geographic and functional combatant commanders. And what a lot of people don't understand, and General Mark Milley used to try and educate our colleagues about this, is that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is a statutory advisor to the Secretary of Defense and to the President. And that is the role that he's responsible for. He did a great job for me, and I think he served the President well also. But that's his role. It's not a command role, not an operational role. And so that's and understanding the roles that different people play is critical. And then you've got the service chiefs and service secretaries who are also in the chain of command, but not in an operational mode, but in terms of, as you know from Title 10, manning, training, equipping, and organizing the force that they then hand off to the combatant commanders to deploy and employ. And that's a very important distinction in our way.
And as the Secretary of the Army, the civilian head of the Department of the Army, you were subject to the authority, direction, and control of then Secretary Jim Mattis.
Right.
But your Army chief, who was then at one point Mark Milley, was subject to your authority, direction, and control. So the point is, and that was the framers of Goldwater-Nichols wanted to make sure we had absolute civilian control of the military. And so and like you say, there's only one person other than the commander-in-chief. And by the way, he has to go through the Secretary of Defense to the warfighting commands. And so there were a number of instances where, there were times when there were suggestions made to the warfighting commands. One that comes to mind in the book that frankly would concern me as someone that is really a student of this area was you mentioned in the book that at one point there were some suggestions by some of the senior staff in the White House that we move 250,000 active duty military to the southern border to help protect the border, and that perhaps some people in the Department of Homeland Security were also involved. And the U.S. Northern Command, which is one of the warfighting commands established by Don Rumsfeld after 9/11, whose whole mission is to protect the United States of America, the land space, the airspace, some of the sea space. Northern Command actually started planning for that operation based on a suggestion by a staffer at the White House that had no authority to do so. And you, as Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, didn't know about it. Tell me a little bit about that situation. That should worry us, that one of our warfighting commands would be acting on guidance and direction that didn't come from the Secretary of Defense.
Well, yeah, I recount this story where I'm in the Oval Office and Stephen Miller speaks up from behind me and says, we need to send 250,000 troops to the border to deal with caravans coming up from Central America. And I think he's joking. I turn around. He presses again, and I say, I don't have 250,000 troops to deal with that nonsense. DHS can handle it. And he had suggested they were working on it, and I came back to the Pentagon, and a day or so later pulled General Milley aside, and I told him, check on it. Let's make sure nothing's going on. And to our surprise, there was planning happening, and I assume it was kind of layers below the commander. And DOD likes to lean into things, and for all they knew, it was guidance coming from the White House. I don't know exactly how it flowed, but that was my assumption. And I shut it down immediately because I just thought it was completely foolhardy. It wasn't the right way to address the problem. And look, we have a problem on the border. We need border security. We need to know who's coming across and what they're bringing. But the solution wasn't 250,000 troops that I didn't have to begin with. It's beefing up DHS. It's giving DHS the officers, the material, the resources they need to do it. And so I kind of shut that down immediately and put the word out. If anybody in DOD or DHS or whatever has a problem, come see me and I'll deal with it. Because at the end of the day, nobody was going anywhere unless I signed the deployment order. And I knew I wasn't about to send 250,000 troops to the border. We already had some troops down there, a few thousand, just like President Biden has today. But it was just another outlandish idea.
So in that area, of course, as you mentioned, our active duty military, the Guard and Reserve were called up for COVID and did a variety of things from medical essential things to basically operating medical stations, but handing out supplies and things of that nature. And we call that defense support to civil authorities.
Right.
And there are a number of times in the book where you basically, because of the civil unrest, there were requirements for our military to perhaps be a participant. And one thing people should understand, for example, had those 250,000 active duty troops been sent to the border, they have no law enforcement authority under posse comitatus. Now, the president can declare certain national emergencies and perhaps, but the Guard actually, the National Guard, can actually exercise law enforcement. So talk a little bit about some of the civil unrest situations that you had to deal with and how you saw the role of the active military compared to that of the National Guard.
So I was fortunate in this sense, based on my experience, that I served on active duty, I served in the Guard, I served in reserve. So I had a fairly good understanding of what not just the roles and responsibilities of each were, but also the training and the equipping and what they could do. And I was in the D.C. Guard, for example. And look, you're right, particularly when it comes to civil unrest. There is a role for the National Guard, principally, to support law enforcement. And that was the important thing that I tried to keep reinforcing with the president alongside Attorney General Barr, that law enforcement should deal with civil unrest. And if they need support, then it's the role of the governors to make that determination. And if it's in the Capitol, then, of course, the president, through his chain of command, can do that. But my view is should always be last in terms of consideration, and then use the Guard because of the authorities they have. And, after the walk we made through Lafayette Park, which was a mistake for me, and certainly I know General Milley feels the same way, that night I directed that a memo be prepared for me. I signed it out mid-afternoon the next day that basically said, look, we have a role in providing support to civilian authorities, particularly in dealing with civil unrest, because as I write in there, I believe in law and order, and I believe that Americans should have the right to exercise their First Amendment rights of assembly and protest and petition. And unfortunately, it was, there were people in that crowd that were doing violent things that were denying people that peaceful right. So we had that. I wanted to make sure people understood we had a right to safeguard Americans' rights to protest their government. But at the same time, we are an apolitical organization and need to stay away from being caught up in the politics of those moments and those days. And look, that's a tough thread to to weave there as you go through this day by day. But keep in mind, we had, in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd, hundreds of cities where civil unrest was happening. And you have to give people that room to express themselves peacefully about what they see as injustice or whatever the case may be.
And you felt like, I think, you created the right balance, even though there were people that maybe wanted you to go a little bit further using active duty troops. A couple of anecdotes in there about people making suggestions about things we wouldn't do, which is shoot our fellow Americans and things like that. But did you feel like that in the areas where you got pushed on, you were able to implement the correct balance between law enforcement and the role of our military, particularly the National Guard?
Yeah, I think in terms of outcomes, if you look at it, I think we got it right at the end of the day, that law enforcement led. We would argue internally that it should be local law enforcement and then state and then federal. And then if you need the Guard, you could use the Guard. But in all these instances, to include Lafayette Park, the Guard performed its mission of protecting federal buildings and federal activities. And one of the mistaken reporting coming out of that day and the subsequent days was somehow that the Guard used violence and shot pepper balls and rubber bullets. None of that happened. The Guard performed its mission and stayed in terms of protecting those institutions and activities. So I was very proud of them. You had on any one day during that summer of 2020, you had guardsmen out in the streets, protecting federal facilities and Americans' right to protest. You had another group of guardsmen in hospitals, field hospitals, taking care of their fellow Americans who were dealing with COVID. And you had other guardsmen out deployed in hot spots around the world. And even then, you still had guardsmen dealing with wildfires in California or flooding in the Midwest. It just was a tremendous time for the National Guard, and I think it was their year.
And from your own service in the Army Reserve and the Army Guard, since 9/11, we've had over 1 million members of the National Guard and Reserve mobilized and deployed overseas or at home, and they get demobilized. And they are a true bargain for the taxpayer because you don't have to put in place all the infrastructure that you have to have for active duty troops that are on active duty 365 days a year. So the Guard and Reserve, you've made the point, they're operational now. They're very different from the Strategic Reserve they were in the peak of the Cold War, and you see them on the front lines every single day. And I know the American people appreciate that, and they appreciate the leadership. One thing in that area, and I want to read from my paper because of some of the concerns you had, you and General Milley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, established what you call the 4 no's: no unnecessary wars, no strategic retreats, no politicization of DOD, and no misuse of the military. You've addressed that with the Guard. Mm-hmm. So how were you able to deal with these concerns and handle decisions you didn't agree with? You didn't agree with the plan to remove troops from Germany, although you put in place an alternative. There was withholding of aid from Ukraine. Finally, it did get over there. Blockade in Cuba and Venezuela, activity with Iran. Some instances it was suggested call up retired officers from active duty and court-martial them because they're saying things people didn't like. And what were you prepared to do if there was a case when there was a red line that was crossed and you weren't able to support it?
Yeah, look, a lot of great questions here, and it's one of the things I wrestled with a lot. You go back to the book, Sacred Oath. This oath is to the Constitution, but part of the Constitution is Article 2, which establishes the president. He's the commander-in-chief, and you're also bound to obey his lawful orders. And, in many ways, I was fortunate because President Trump rarely issued orders, but for the Germany case. But kind of walk through these things sequentially. You're right. In terms of Ukraine assistance, which we are obligated to do under the law because Congress appropriated, it would be me at times or me and John Bolton or John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, and I would engage the president and kind of push him to release the security assistance for Ukraine. It eventually happened. We learned why later. I at least did through the media. Why he was holding it up. But that wasn't a case where my duty was to go back to him and push and press and make every possible argument I could to get that released. And I talk about it in the book. In other cases with, NATO or in the case where I got the written order to withdraw troops from Germany, my game plan was to really give my commander, now we're talking about combatant commander General Todd Walters for European Command, I gave him a series of principles I wanted to do some planning off of, that I would reassure our allies, I would deter Russia, take care of our troops, 5 things. And he came back with a pretty good concept that at the end of the day met the president's direct order to withdraw troops, but at the same time allowed me to take those troops that we withdrew from Germany and either consolidate them in other countries or eventually push them forward closer to Russia, which met these principles I had defined as reassure allies and deter Russia. And I thought it was a very clever idea put forward by the combatant commander. I endorsed it. We briefed it to the president. He knew exactly what we were doing when I briefed him, and it met what he wanted. And so I thought it was, again, I didn't like its origin, but what we came up with at the end of the day was a workable solution to meet the president's intent. But for me, to do it in a way that made strategic sense, that bolstered our presence in Europe, and that deterred the Russians. And look where we are today. And frankly, I wish they had followed the plan because we would have had more troops in Romania, Poland, and
right,
elsewhere.
and we're expanding our troops. And I mean, one of your first trips, actually, you went over to NATO to reassure our NATO allies, but actually to put them on the spot. I mean, even when you and I were working on the Hill together, our bosses were saying our NATO allies aren't carrying their fair share. So that was a legitimate thing for the president to make.
Yeah,
but I mean, you were a big supporter of NATO, and I think we see today NATO's more important than ever. Would that be your assessment too?
Look, I do. I was I served in NATO as a young Army officer in Europe in the 1990s, and yes, I went to Brussels as acting SecDef before I was confirmed. Before I think the president put my name forward.
We won't tell the Senate that.
I said publicly that I believed in NATO, that I thought it was important, but, and this is where President Trump was right, they needed to live up to their obligations. I think at the time only 6 or 7 countries was living up to its 2% GDP commitment. And he was right that Germany was in the wrong for supporting Nord Stream 2. So I also carried those messages as well. And so I think, unfortunately, the Ukrainians are paying the price for everybody not being on guard enough or wary enough about Russia. And I think hopefully now we'll see more NATO countries meet those commitments.
Well, and let's talk about Russia, because frankly, one of the things that you did early on as Secretary of the Army with Jim Mattis and then as Secretary of Defense, we had a new national defense strategy. Actually, there hadn't been one in a number of years. And as you know from your service in OSD policy, from other jobs, that it's a fundamental planning document for the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense decision-making process, which is being reviewed by a congressional commission, the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system, which is how the department puts its decision into monetary factors. It becomes a budget they submit to the Congress, is guided by a bunch of documents, one of which, of course, is the National Defense Strategy, which should flow from the overall national security strategy. And when Mattis took over SecDef, you took over Sec Army, you spent a lot of time and came out with a national defense strategy that was really revolved around what you call great power competition, near-peer competitors, China, Russia, to a more limited extent, North Korea and Iran, and then global terrorism. And, of course, Russia was a centerpiece. China was a centerpiece. Talk a little bit about what you did as Secretary of Defense to ensure that the National Defense Strategy was not just a bunch of words. And look at what's happening now. Russia basically is doing some of the things the new strategy said was going to happen if we didn't deter them. And then I'm going to go to China next. But let's talk about what you did as Secretary of Defense to try to implement that strategy. And I'd like to get your sense, where do you feel it is today?
Right. Well, look, I thought it was a solid strategy. And I think this is another accomplishment of the Trump administration. One of the things that it did, first time ever, was consolidate a U.S. government view that China is a strategic adversary. And I thought that was extremely important, particularly all the years I worked on China issues. And so, but that said, my sense as Secretary of the Army was that it wasn't being implemented. And as I came in as Secretary of Defense, what I told others, what I told my chain of command, what I said to the Congress, to the Senate during my nomination was I would make implementation of the NDS, National Defense Strategy, my priority, top priority. And so within a couple months of taking office in July 2019, I had this senior leaders conference. I brought everybody in, civilian and military, leaning heavily on my civilian side to draft up what we called the 10 objectives, right, that would be the implementation objectives by which we would implement the NDS. So it was everything from defining China as the pacing threat to new operational concepts such as immediate reaction forces. We needed to update all of our war plans. I mean, it goes on and on and on about the objectives because, look, when you're leading a large organization like DOD, right, 2.8 million people, I can't get out and tell everybody what I want them to do. Right. And so you do it through documents such as the NDS. You do it through documents such as an implementation plan. And that's the way by which you do it. And you supplement it by visiting the commands, by visiting people and explaining and emphasizing and urging and checking on it. And I made that part and parcel of my weekly duties was every week to check on with the entire team assembled. How are we doing in terms of implementation? Where do we need to make changes, tweaks, adjustments, et cetera? And I think we made a lot of good progress.
So everything actually under Title 10 is supposed to flow from the requirements of the warfighting commands. In other words, it says the Secretary of the Army, you will organize, train, and equip in support of the requirements of the warfighting commands. You talked about the contingency plans. Did the warfighting commands, there were a lot of them, Central Command, European Command, Indo-Pacific Command, did they make the adjustments in their contingency plans to take into account China is the pacing threat and Russia in the NDS before you left?
Well, we had begun reviewing all those war plans, principally the China and Russia war plans, to make sure that the demands, the requirements of the combatant commanders actually met what we could supply or provide. And if it didn't, then why aren't the services adapting? Why isn't our acquisition system adapting to that? And why weren't we budgeting for those resources or people or organizations that they needed? And that is really the meat and potatoes of being SecDef, is making sure that you have sound war plans that meet the intent of the commander-in-chief and his policies, and that you have budgeted and resourced it to deliver what the combatant commanders think they need. And, of course, part of my job was getting into the plans and second-guessing the combatant commanders, understanding what they were doing, making sure it met the policy ends we were trying to achieve. And that became a weekly function for me to kind of go through that in detail. And not just with them, but look, these days we recognized, and the National Defense Strategy said this, was that it was great power competition on a global scale. So when you think about a fight with Russia or China, it just can't be in the Indo-Pacific, right? You have to think about, well, I may have to engage them in Latin America or in the Middle East or maybe somewhere on the European continent, or at least have to draw resources from those places to do so. So for me, it was important to have all the other combatant commanders in the room, particularly people like, as well, Northern Command, because they had to defend the United States, or Transportation Command, which is a functional command that would provide all the cargo aircraft and tankers, et cetera, that would keep the fight going. So you got to have all those people in the room to understand the plan, or at least what the combatant commander was requesting.
As a staffer on the Hill decades ago, you actually got people focused on China. You started talking about worry about China. You served on a China commission. Mm-hmm. I remember in the peak of the Cold War, my dad, who was a 1938 graduate of the Citadel, served with Patton's Army in Europe. As we were worrying about the Cold War and I was serving on the staff, he'd say, "Son, don't forget about China." I said, "What the heck are you talking about, Dad? It's Russia." Well, his roommate was a Chinese American, and he learned a lot. He said, "China wants to get after us." He said, "China's going to, if it takes them 1,000 years, they're going to take over the United States." And frankly, in the NDS from Jim Mattis, you said China's the pacing threat. Mm-hmm. And if you look at China, they're on the march. They're on the march militarily. They're on the march economically. They have more diplomatic posts now around the world than the United States. And the thing to me that's most scary is they're on the march technologically, and in many areas they're ahead of us technologically. And frankly, in some of them are military areas. In some areas we're still ahead. And of course they're threatening Taiwan. So talk a little bit about what more needs. It's clear we haven't done all we need to do on China. And unlike Russia, they're an economic threat. Yeah. They're a political threat. They're a military threat. So talk a little bit about China.
Look, you've hit all the key points. This is why they are the greatest challenge we face in the 21st century. And I've been studying them since at least 1995 when I was an Army war planner working the Indo-Pacific, or the Pacific Command at that time, profile. I was responsible for that portfolio. And so, yeah, look, they are the greatest threat we face because of all these things. The political might they bring, their long-term planning. They've told us, they've written about it, that by 2035 they want to have a modern military, and by 2049 they want to dominate at least the Western Pacific.
They're pretty modern military today.
They are. We can talk about that, particularly when it comes to the Navy. And so, look, they're on the march. They have diplomatic heft. They're spreading money around the world, trying to kind of bind to countries through their Belt and Road Initiative. You talk about the economy. Unlike the Soviet Union, and I grew up in the Cold War as you did as well, China now possesses the second largest economy in the world at $16 trillion. The Russians never had that. And also, as you say, the Chinese have a lot of great technology, and they're continue to grow that. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's on our backs. They're stealing our intellectual property, our plans. And, the FBI has talked about, I think every 12 hours they open up an espionage case against the Chinese government. So we need to be very concerned. I don't think we're in a position yet to really fully deal with them. Again, I do give the Trump administration, I think we all collectively did a good job forming a consensus that China was our strategic adversary and getting many of our allies, both in Europe and Asia, on board with that concept. And I think we need to keep pushing in that direction.
Well, there's bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. They recognize this and they want to do something about it. What more do we need to be doing with China now so that we don't get ourselves in a situation that we got into with Ukraine?
I think we need to beef up other parts of the government. So we need to beef up the State Department, right, for our diplomatic efforts around the globe, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, just recently we learned that the Solomon Islands is signing some type of security agreement with the Chinese in the Pacific Island countries. That's terrible, right? We need to overturn that. But beef up State Department, beef up USAID to go into parts of Latin America and Africa and elsewhere where American diplomacy through aid and assistance can help grow it. In terms of DOD, we need to modernize our military. We need to make these big shifts in terms of how do you fight in the Indo-Pacific. And that's going to require more defense spending. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but we're making this transition from what I call the Reagan Cold War military, at least for the Army, that was built up to a new type of military that can deal with China in the 21st century. That's why the Navy, U.S. Navy, is trying to make this transition. It's hard without more money. So there's all those things, and we need to bring all the allies and partners aboard as well. They just can't be focused on their own front yard, right? They need to focus on what's happening with China. And look, the other thing, too, is China has managed to eke its way into all these UN organizations where they're trying to seek control of United Nations bodies and drive, whether it's intellectual property or the WHO, the UN itself. And we need to just be very conscious of this and come up with a national game plan to deal with it.
Well, let me talk about spending more money, because one of your efforts at reform was quite notable, and one of the reasons you need reform is, and as you know, in my second book titled The Ever-Shrinking Fighting Force, I point out how we're spending more in constant dollars, taking inflation out, than the peak of the Reagan buildup, which was quite significant. You were part of that. And yet we have 1 million less active duty. The Army's 50% smaller. The Navy's 50% smaller. We have 50% less fighting units. We're not getting the bang the buck that we should. And I agree with you. We've got to increase. We've got to cover inflation. We've got to cover the modernization. But if we don't get more bang for the buck, we're not going to get the kind of capabilities you're talking about that we need vis-a-vis China. And you started the Army Night Court, which was an effort at reform. Secretary Mattis had three priorities, which was strengthen the lethality and the warfighting readiness of our military, strengthen our alliances and increase our partnerships, and reform the military. You added a fourth one that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which take care of our troops and our families. But let's talk about reform. Right. And so you did in the Night Court, you said, look, we're going to squeeze the budget. We got to get money for modernization. And then you brought it to the Secretary of Defense. And one of the things you took on, and I'll be quite honest, we never did it in the Congress. I wish we had. Very few, if any, of your predecessors took it on. And that was what I call the overhead in the Department of Defense. If you look at what we call defense-wide spending, people argue about these numbers. DOD will admit it's between 17 to 20%. But if you add in what's called the classified spending on the big defense agencies, it's closer to 30%. So almost a third of the budget is spent on defense-wide spending, not on the tip of the spear. And we started with one defense agency, the National Security Agency. We now have 28. Mm-hmm. These agencies are large behemoths: Defense Logistics Agency, a worldwide communications agency, a worldwide grocery chain, a worldwide dependent school system, a defense missile agency. And you started to take that on because you say, look, some of these things are big businesses, yet they're not run like a business. And they're military support organizations. And you tried to bring reform to the defense agencies, but probably left before you could get, really what you wanted to get done. But talk a little bit about how we need to reform what we're doing in the Pentagon. And don't get me wrong, and I'm making a little bit of a longer question because I want to say, as you said in the beginning of your book, you gave credit to the men and women, active duty, Guard and Reserve, defense civilians, defense contractors, federally funded research and development. They come to work in the Pentagon every day to do the very best job they can for the warfighter and for the taxpayers, like the congressional staff. And yet, former Secretary of Defense told me, Bill Perry said, Arnold, bad processes beat good people every day. Mm-hmm. And in DOD, we still have a lot of a proliferation of bad processes, which you tried to reform. Talk a little bit about your reform efforts, particularly as it relates to these massive defense agencies.
Yeah, so much there to go after. You know, I came in as Secretary of the Army late 2018, and within 6 months wrote a vision statement of where I wanted to take the Army. And General Milley fully supported me on that, co-signed this vision statement we put out. But I knew making that transition, right, in terms of reorganizing the force, a new talent personnel system, new equipment to deal with the China and Russia that we saw ahead, that I would need more money. And as much as I was going to go back to Congress and ask for that, I felt at the end of the day, because President Trump was really good in terms of giving us extra money, I knew at the end of the day we had to do a lot of our own internal work, kind of get rid of the fat if we could, and make some hard choices. And so that's where Night Court began, as we introduced our 6 modernization priorities for the Army, which was everything from soldier lethality to long-range precision fires. I knew it would take billions of dollars. And when the team first presented me the budget, I didn't see it in there. And I just had to say time out to the process. I called them back in and said, I want all 500-plus programs ranked order 1 to 500. And by the way, the 34 or so programs that we're building the Army modernization on had to come first. And what that ended up doing is people came in through a series of meetings. I think the chain of command and I spent over 50 hours reviewing program after program, cutting and trimming and reducing. And at the end of the day, we freed up over $40-some billion, cut 186 programs. Because my view was, I can only control what I control, take care of myself. I'll do my own handiwork with the Department of the Army to deal with that. And we were able to find that much money to reinvest in the Army. And I was just down at Army Futures Command not long ago, and they told me that that by next year, by 23, they're going to deliver on 24 of those 31 programs, kind of an initial rollout, low-rate initial production, et cetera. So it's a great achievement, and I attribute that to the entire team at the time that did it. But to your next point, though, you talk about when we're building this budget and aggressively for the Army, cutting into it and going hard and prioritizing and reprioritizing and making these choices. At one point, I get a bill from OSD, and they say you have to chip in, $2-3 billion to pay for this or that, and it really got me angry, and I was complaining why and this and that, and couldn't get a good answer, and I had to pay my bill. So when I become Secretary of Defense, I now have the budget, and I find out what's going on. The so-called fourth estate that you call overhead is something that consumes, over $110 billion a year, and it's a couple dozen agencies, and what they were doing was just
28.
They had all their programs and activities, and in some ways they would work with the combatant commands, and they would levy bills on the services. And they weren't subject, in my view, to any supervision or oversight or checking to see if it was consistent with where the department was going. So I clamped down on that. And in fact, one of the things that we did was we put a civilian in charge of the fourth estate to manage its administrative and budgetary stuff so that they couldn't grow personnel, they couldn't make these budget demands, and really cut it back. And I thought it was a kind of a big accomplishment. We needed more work to do on that. But look, I think they should be subject to all that. And then, of course, you got to deal with all the other growth that happens out there. But that's really the hard work of the department. And as much as I can say on one hand, we need to grow the defense budget, and I was a big supporter of the 3 to 5% annual growth, we also still, as DOD civilians and senior military officers, have a duty to the American people to be good stewards of every single dollar, which means even when we're getting the additional cash, we still got to go back in there and get rid of the excess, the fat, et cetera, and we have to do good audits. And that's really the hard work of the department. And frankly, look, it's not going to get done unless the Secretary of Defense gets involved. And that's why I put a lot of personal time toward that. David Norquist, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and I think in a 2-month period in August and September, found $5, $6, $7 billion that we could immediately cut and put back into warfighting. And some people said that wasn't enough, but for me, that was a good start for all the time we put into it.
Well, and look, these are important organizations. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, the point is we need to get more bang for the buck out of them, just like you got more bang for the buck out of the Army. And as Secretary of the Army, you had the Army by the stack and swivel. That's a term we understand as military folks. As Secretary of Defense, it's a little bit harder to get control of some of these organizations. One of the things that, we do have the world's finest military. We want to keep it that way. And there are really 3 reasons. We recruit and retain the best people and their families, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We give them constant realistic training, but we also, from our industry, give them the best technology so they're never in a fair fight. You worked in industry. How important is the defense industrial base and the technologies then? And as Secretary of Defense, you prioritized, I think, 10 or 11 top priorities, from hypersonics to artificial intelligence to quantum, 5G. How important to our country and to our economy is keeping a focus on these cutting-edge technologies, particularly when China, we know they're ahead of us in hypersonics. Some people would argue they're ahead of us in AI. Other people say, well, not so much. Quantum, General Hyten, the former vice chairman, says it's still an open book in quantum, but it's very important. Talk a little bit about the importance of our industrial base.
Yeah. And before I do so, I'd also add, what's important about the United States military and our personnel is how we empower non-commissioned officers.
Right, exactly.
We're seeing this play out on the battlefield in Ukraine versus Russia, how non-commissioned officers are really the strength of our military. But yeah, look, I served many years in the defense industry. It gave me a good insight into what makes them function, into what incentivizes them, and also in terms of how they operate. So I was able to leverage that a good deal as I came back to be Secretary of the Army and Secretary of Defense. And I would meet weekly as Sec Army with industry to kind of find out how can we improve, how can we do better. It helped when I stood up Army Futures Command in terms of how we craft that. I know that industry needs predictability. And so one of the things we set out to do, we being myself, Under Secretary Ryan McCarthy, and then Jim McConville, Mark Milley as the two Army senior leaders, was to put predictability into what the Army wanted and not change it. Because if you can get predictability and if you can put money behind it, industry will respond and they will innovate. And I'm proud to say it's 2022, 4 years later. The Army still hasn't changed its prioritization in terms of modernization. And that's key in terms of signaling to both to industry, but also to the Army where you're going. Now, I'll tell you, since I left service, I'm working more in venture capital. I'm on a firm called Red Cell doing a lot of interesting work. I wish I knew more about that part of the ecosystem because that's really where innovation happens. And some of the companies, founders, innovators that I take briefings from, I hear from, are just doing cutting-edge work. And what I'm hoping I'm able to do now that I wish I had known then was how do you get those really small innovators and founders before DoD senior leadership so that we can make those big bets, just like venture capital does, on cutting-edge technologies that will allow us to leapfrog the Chinese. And if I could do it all over again, I would be meeting with those guys at least quarterly to find out, to make those big bets. Because, again, the problem with acquisition in DoD, it's so bureaucratic and they're risk-averse. But if you have the Secretary of Defense personally involved and willing to kind of make those big bets, willing to kind of to get some of them wrong, but knowing that if you get some right, it'll really make a difference. That's the key.
That's so important. And I think the Congress ought to give the DOD people some incentives to take risk. And we need to get the DOD lawyers to let the senior leaders meet with some of these cutting-edge industries, not thinking it's giving them an advantage over someone else. When I talk to the Silicon Valley and these cutting-edge commercial firms and everybody, they get so frustrated, as you well know. They tell you the same thing of dealing with the bureaucracy. And the leaders at the top, if you look now, worked in the Army, Heidi Shue, who's now the head of technology in the Department of Defense. She's very aggressive in this area. And the DOD, Kath Hicks, who followed David Norquist as the chief operating officer, they want this technology in our government. They want it for our military, but the bureaucracy is really an encumbrance. So that you're spot on that.
That's why we put Army Futures Command in Austin, Texas, which was a hub of innovation. But even today, I sit on the board of small companies. And they sit in this valley of death for 18 months, and they just can't survive if you're a company of 100, 200 people. How do you make it through, even though they have cutting technology?
Your acquisition secretary, Ellen Lord, did a terrific job. She's been followed by Bill LaPlante, who said in his confirmation hearing, we've got to get back to hot production lines. So I think there's an incentive by the leaders, both in your tenure and the current tenure, to do this. We just got to get around the bureaucracy. One of your top priorities.
And I talk about this in the book. This is an important chapter. This book is not all about Donald Trump.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
People want to portray it that way, but this is about my tenure, and there are whole chapters here that barely mention, if at all, the president. And this is one of them. Right? Is how do you innovate and how do you reform?
And look, this is critically important for the American people, for history. All your predecessors, Harold Brown, Bill Perry, Donald Rumsfeld, Bob Gates, Leon Panetta, Ash Carter have written books, and these are all important because, as we said, the Department of Defense is a learning organization. It's one of the few organizations in government that's always striving to do better. And so people, this is a Bible for not just the war colleges, but for people in industry to look at the things we need to fix. And that's going to be my last question. But
I wrote the book for three audiences. One was the American people in history, but this next two were people in government and DOD, so people could learn these lessons. I've referred many times, all of my predecessors, I think nearly all of them, have written books.
Right.
And I would go back and read their books and try and understand, how they did things or lessons learned, just like you're saying.
So you were a military family. So when you added to the fourth priority, the military families, spouse, child care, when the volunteer force was put into effect in 1973 from the draft that was so unpopular in Vietnam, President Nixon had asked the former Secretary of Defense, Gates, not Bob Gates, to do a commission. And he said, look, we should go to a volunteer force. We got to fix three things, though, the cliff retirement system, the up-route promotion system, and pay should be based on skills and performance, not time and grade. Very few of those things have changed, but we do have a volunteer force. But in the 70s, it almost went under, and we didn't pay enough attention to the family. Nowadays, if you don't have child care, if you don't have programs for spouses to get employment, you're going to lose the best and the brightest. You had that as a real priority. Tell us a little bit about why and what you did.
When I entered active duty as an officer in 1986 at Fort Campbell, it seemed to me that most folks weren't married and had kids. But over time, that changed. And now what you have is, folks are married. They're often married to military spouses. And, of course, in today's society, most spouses work. And so what I find, it's this kind of old adage we say, right? You recruit the soldier, but you retain the family. And I just saw too many places where we were talking the talk and not doing enough to deliver on that. And so I really went after, how do we fix the employment system for our spouses? How do we go after recognizing certificates, right, as you move from state to state? Because the spouses were having a hard time getting hired because they didn't have the proper credentials. And we tried to work either by ourselves. I worked a lot with my fellow service secretaries and with the Hill to kind of break that down. And then as I went after as I went after child care, I found that the biggest problem in our child care wasn't necessarily spaces. It was the fact that they were often only 3/4 filled because our hiring system wasn't up to the task. So we went after tackling that. And then there are, a myriad of other things, and I describe it in the end as kind of chapter about just the nature of the military and its bureaucracy, where we were telling families that you can't come into the PX or the commissary unless you're properly dressed, right? And as you noted, look, my wife and I served 21 years. She was with me since I was a young lieutenant, saw me go off to war. We PCS'd multiple times to Europe, back to Europe within the United States. We dealt with child care. We dealt with all these things. And she was an incredible help to me and would pick up these ideas as she met with spouses as we would go on the road. And one of the complaints was, why can't I wear fitness gear into our PXs and commissaries? And just the bureaucratic resistance to something like as simple as that. Because my view was, look, the sailor, the airman, the soldier, the Marine may have signed up for the military, but the spouses didn't. It's a family business, but let's not make it unnecessarily difficult on what is the strength of the U.S. military at this point, which is the families that support our service members.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same in other parts of America. But you got very frustrated with that priority, and I could see where the acquisition system would frustrate you. I could see where the trying to fix the fourth estate would frustrate you. But frankly, this is such a no-brainer about the families. What made it so frustrating that
I lived it, my wife lived it. It's just that you're trying to, what should be a service initiative to go out there and allow to make life easier for our families, in this case allowing them to wear fitness gear into our commissaries and PXs, met this stiff bureaucratic resistance. And I said, okay, well, if it's your responsibility, then fix it. And I just found an unwillingness to fix it. I don't think it was coming from the civilians as much as from the kind of ingrained culture of the military. At the end of the day, I said, look, I've had enough. I'm just gonna have to do what a Secretary of Defense shouldn't have to do, and to tell military families that yes, you're allowed to wear fitness gear, leisure gear, if you will, into the PXs and commissaries and stuff like that. It was a small thing, but I think an important thing for our families. And I just wanted to signal that every day I went in, I kept our families in mind as I dealt with all these issues.
We're getting towards the end of our program, and civilian control of the military, we've talked about that. It was so fundamental to your moral compass that you adhere to the Constitution, maintain what you call civilian control of the military. One of the areas that we've had somewhat of a controversy. Jim Mattis had to get a waiver from the Congress to serve because he had not been retired long enough. Same with Secretary Austin. Me personally, I've never been in favor of the retired military. That's why we put in a 10-year provision. Now it's back to 10 years. You've been Secretary of the Navy. You've served in the military. I know you admire both of those individuals. You and I both admire them. But frankly, do you think we ought to have recently retired military people serve as Secretary of Defense?
Well, let me begin the answer by saying this much. My hometown boyhood hero is George Marshall. And George Marshall was Secretary of Defense in September, I think, 1950. He was called back by Truman to help after the failings of the military in Korea. And he didn't think that it made sense for a former, retired military officer to be a Secretary of Defense, but did it nonetheless. And look, to answer your question directly, no, I don't think so. I think that kind of moratorium of 10 years or whatever it was made sense. It has nothing to do with Secretary Mattis or Secretary Austin. It has everything to do with kind of making sure that you have a distinct difference between the military culture and the civilian culture. And they're very different skill sets in terms of what both bring to the job. It doesn't mean you can't be successful, but I think having that separation makes a big difference. And I would support, reinstating that moratorium and maintaining it. We have enough good people out there that are civilians that can fulfill that role as Secretary of Defense to do that, because I think civilian control of the military is critical. I have a whole chapter in there where I outline some of the problems I saw coming in as a civilian secretary, that I didn't think the civilians were being used enough. I mean, I had to forcibly push civilians into the war planning and review process, as an example. And there are other areas where I got pushback from the brass, but nonetheless, I had good civilian secretaries and good civilian leaders in OSD that were able to push through that and try and pull some of that control back. And as I talk about in the conclusion of that chapter, this is something that I think the Congress needs to relook.
Well, it's very clear from our conversation today, Secretary Esper, it's very clear from this truly remarkable, important book. It's very clear from your entire history and your entire experience that you did bear true faith and allegiance to your oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I know I speak as a person. I know my family. I know everybody that knows you. I know the American public appreciates what you did, your service, that of your family. And again, I think you have a lot of valuable lessons to convey to the Congress, to the American people. Continue to work to support a strong national defense. And so we greatly admire you and thank you. And obviously, we thank C-SPAN for giving us this opportunity to spend so much time allowing you to talk about things that are so important to the future of our country. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.